Welcome to In the Ven Zone with Christine McKay, where we get candid about what it takes to negotiate effectively. You'll learn from the challenges and successes of entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. We help you change the nature of your negotiations and get more from every deal you do.
Welcome back, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us here on In the Ven Zone, where we talk about negotiation. Specifically, we are here to help support you as small business owners, help you to ask for more of what you want, and teach you the negotiation skills and techniques to help you get it. So today, I'm really honored and excited to have somebody I have known for a long time, but actually we kind of lost touch for a while. And I'm really excited that we reconnected again after doing a networking like, oh my gosh, it had to be almost 15, 20 years ago. It was a while. So anyway, I'm just excited to have with us Chris Selland today. And did I say your last name right? I never asked you that
You
before.
did.
Awesome.
No,
Okay.
you did. Thank you, Christine.
I got something good there. All right. So Chris is the CEO of DipJar, and I'm going to let him explain more about what DipJar is because it's a fascinating company, a fascinating business model. Chris, as a CEO, is responsible for the strategic growth of the organization, a challenge he readily accepts and he meets head on. He is passionate about building successful teams and broadening operating experience in technology companies. And he has led DipJar to its current national recognition. I mean, it has some amazing clients, including National Church Solutions. Yes? National Church
Solutions? Yes. They're a
Yes.
partner, but yes.
As a partner.
Yep, recent partnership.
Salvation Army and a bunch of other organizations. Prior to DipJar, Chris ran go-to-market and strategic alliance initiatives at a number of leading technology companies, including Unify Software, later acquired by Dell, and Vertica Systems, which was then acquired by Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. So Chris has a successful track record of taking companies from startup through to sale, which is really exciting because he's done the same thing at DipJar. So I'm really excited to talk to him about that because that's some really interesting negotiation elements in that. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Operations Research and Industrial Engineering from Cornell University, and he has his MBA in International Business and Economics from New York University Stern School of Business. Chris has served on a number of corporate and nonprofit boards, including serving as a director of the Needham Memorial Day Tournament, one of the largest youth soccer tournaments in the United States, which for those of you who listen to me often know I'm a complete soccer freak. So I love that. I did not know that about you, Chris. I am a massive English Premier League fan. I literally get up and go to the pub pre-COVID to be there for 4 a.m. matches. So I am a huge
Arsenal so you have to tell me who's your club. Which
Arsenal.
one?
I'm an Arsenal fan.
Arsenal. Nice. Gooner. So
yes,
we are on the same team. So yep.
I didn't know
Not
that.
Such a great day. Not such a great day yesterday. No, I didn't know that coming in either. But yeah.
No, but
a little frustrating.
I think the worst part is that Tottenham is on the top of the table right now, and that's a very depressing thing. So one of my friends is a Tottenham fan, and he texted me, and I said, "That's never happened in my lifetime." And he said, "Nor in mine." I said, "Yeah, that's because you're younger than I." My husband was recently, just last week, I had this amazing opportunity to interview Jillian Michaels, who's a fitness trainer and certified nutritionist. And at the exact same time I was interviewing her, my husband was having a conversation with the CTO of the Tottenham Hotspurs because they're trying to think through some different things around animation in their new stadium and how they're using their billboarding, new billboarding. So it was very cool. It was kind of cool as much as I hate the fact that it was Tottenham, but that's okay.
Well, I'll give you a hook for a future interview. So back in, I think it was 2013, we had our first customer conference at Vertica, which again had been acquired by HP, and we were bringing a bunch of customers in, and we were an analytics company. We were looking for a speaker. And we said, well, who's a big name in analytics who'd be interesting to tell us sort of non-tech story? And so sure enough, we found Billy Beane of Moneyball,
Wow.
Moneyball Billy Beane. Brought him in as a speaker. And since I had founded and was running the conference, we had a little reception after. I got to talk to him quite a bit one-on-one. He's actually a big Arsenal fan too. And it was interesting because this was during this, Wenger was still there, very much. And his philosophy is very aligned with Moneyball. So I had a fascinating conversation with Billy Beane about Arsenal and about Moneyball and about his philosophy on analytics and everything. So if you're looking for a future guest, I don't know if I have his personal email anymore, but anyway, I would recommend you bring him in, and you can use that as a hook. Yeah,
I would love that. You know who else I really want to interview? I want to interview somebody who is involved. And guys, we'll get to DipJar in a second, but clearly soccer is very important, or football, as I call it. It's super important. I want to interview somebody involved with negotiating Jurgen Klopp's contract, because I am convinced that he had a clause in his contract that gave him a 3-year window to start performing. I am convinced of it, given the speed with which the revolving door that they had in terms of managers before Jurgen got there. I just am like, I want to know what that contract was all about. So if anyone listening can get me in touch with that person, I am all about that. I would love to have more information about how Jurgen negotiated that. As much as I'm not a Liverpudlian, it's okay. I respect you if you are one. So anyway. Awesome.
Well, I have his book on my Kindle. I haven't read it yet, but I'll dig in to see if there's any details. Although I kind of doubt he's going to have details of the contract and his autobiography, but that's one I intend to read. So anyway.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being here. And it's always great
to be here
on the show. So awesome. Thank you. It's good to see you, and welcome. Tell us a little bit more about you and how you ended up as CEO of DipJar.
Sure. Well, I've built most of my career mostly in software. I mean, I've been in tech for 25 plus years, mostly in the Boston area, although I'm originally from New York, but, mostly kind of in the Northeast, really almost entirely. Although I've definitely worked for a lot of companies based in California. So I spent a lot of time, not in the last year, of course, but a lot of time going back and forth coast to coast. But I've always kind of been an East Coast guy in the software business. And I was working for a company called Unify that was actually California based. I was spending a lot of time in California, actually considering whether I wanted to relocate or not. And then I got approached by some of the investors in DipJar, and in particular, one of the advisors who I'd worked with before. Mm-hmm. Most notably at a company called Soundbite. I was at about 10 years ago.
Yep.
And, they basically, the investors knew me, one in particular, actually two in particular, and they approached me. And, DipJar had kind of a history. I'm not a founder. The company, well, anyway, to make a long story short, I was at another company. It was like, okay, this company, they told me this story. It was interesting. I like Boston. It was based here. And, more importantly, I liked two things. One was the kind of the idea, and you briefly mentioned it, that these days, I'll talk to the history in a minute, we mostly serve the nonprofit community. We are very much a for-profit company, so we're here to make money. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a double bottom line to what we do. And I really like that. And again, this was before all the craziness of the last few months. This was a little over 2 years ago. And also just the passion of the people who work there really jumped out at me because, and I think pretty much for all the same reasons, people were really passionate about the job because it was a job that kind of had a little extra meaning for them. So I think of all the things, Boston based, I kind of want to stay in Boston. I wasn't sure I want to move to California, but most importantly, it was based here. But the company definitely had some issues as well. The company was actually founded about 8 years ago at this point. The original idea, and this is where the name came from, was to basically build a device and a network for leaving gratuities, i.e. tips. The DipJar was initially designed to be an electronic tip jar. This was well before I got involved. Most especially in places like coffee shops and pubs. If you mentally rewind back to like 2012, 2014, around when the company started, if you walked into a pub or, a coffee shop for your beverage and you wanted to pay with plastic, because use of plastic was really skyrocketing back then and use of cash was going the other way, and you wanted to pay for your coffee or your beer with plastic, but then you wanted to leave a tip for the bartender or barista, it wasn't always so easy to do that. So that was the original idea that the company set about starting.
And I'm going to interrupt for just a second, just because we have international listeners. I just want to make everybody know that when Chris is saying plastic, he's talking to credit cards. So just so everybody is aware of that.
Correct.
Yep. So keep
Absolutely.
going. I just wanted to jump in so we didn't lose somebody.
That's interesting too, because the credit card or the consumer credit industry is significantly different in different countries these days. Mm-hmm. It is definitely not unified worldwide.
Right.
But we can come back to that. Anyway, to make a long story short, around the time I got the call, which was mid 2018, the gratuity business hadn't really turned into much of a business. There were some customers, and there were a number of these devices that had been sold and distributed, but there was also a lot more in advancements and enhancements in the ways to do payments and the like. And the idea of having a separate device and a separate network for leaving tips really wasn't much of a market to pursue anymore. And the other thing is, for anybody who understands credit card economics, at least in the US, they're pretty disadvantageous for small dollar transactions. So if I want to leave $1 or $2 with a credit card, just kind of the overall fee structure of the industry really winds up, eating up a lot of that. And, it makes a lot more sense when the dollar amounts get bigger. But anyway, to make a long story short, tipping hadn't really worked out as a business. But the investors were seeing that there was some promise in the nonprofit space, because what was happening was people were walking into these probably more coffee shops and pubs and saying, oh, look at that thing. I could use that in my school or my church or my soccer club or what have you. And so they started selling the products to nonprofits. And I should also mention there's a whole software and networking platform behind these devices as well. They're all connected devices. And that hadn't really been exploited hardly at all. So anyway, the tipping market wasn't going well, but the nonprofit market was showing promise, I should say, sorry. And so the investors managed to convince me to take on the role. It was the first time for me as a CEO, so it was exciting. But the company definitely was struggling a bit financially, had a kind of new market that was showing promise, but had kind of, didn't have a lot of cash left in the bank, basically, from kind of having tried another direction and not gone well. So anyway, that kind of fast forward to I guess maybe negotiation one, right? Which is around the time I came in. A big part of why they were looking for a new CEO was that the company needed a new infusion of cash. They needed to raise a new round of funding, but because the company had also been around for a while and a lot of the investors had already been in the deal for a while, there was just different rounds of investment came in at different times on different terms. There was I wouldn't say there was full consensus at the time, but there was pretty close to consensus that we were likely to need a recapitalization, which is basically kind of you kind of wash the cap table clean and almost sort of start over. So, and, it was interesting because when I was negotiating to take the job, a couple of people advised me, and I chose to not ignore their advice. I heard their advice, but not pursue their advice, that I should force the company to take care of that first before I came in, because that was going to be a really hard, ugly process. I just didn't think that was feasible. I mean, even during the interview process, it became clear to me it wasn't going to happen before I came in. So I could either make the decision to come in and try to make it happen. First of all, determining it was definitively needed, which over just a few short weeks and months, we pretty much did. But it was kind of like, should I hold that out as a negotiation point before I take the job? Or should I come in knowing that one of the first things we're probably going to have to do is go through this very hard process? And so I chose the latter because I didn't think the former was feasible, and it worked out, but it was hard. So, but let me stop there, and because that probably encompasses a bunch of questions.
So some of our audience may not understand what a recapitalization is. So could you just kind of give like a really down and dirty 101 version of, so that people who are not familiar with that terminology can understand?
Yeah. I mean, basically, it's essentially a restart. You're kind of starting over from a financing perspective. So generally speaking, what a recapitalization means is that the investors in the prior rounds, are going to get severely, diluted, and they're going to wind up taking a haircut for the sake of being able to raise a new round of money, because, when you get into investing, in all companies, but this is particularly acute in tech companies, there's an expectation that the valuation on each round is going to go up. And then generally speaking, the investors from prior rounds, their investment is worth more money in the next round, and they can choose to participate or not participate. But when it's worth less, it basically means, in sort of Shark Tank terminology, if I invested, X for Y% of the company, all of a sudden my X is going to be worth a lot less than Y, right? So not only do I need to make a decision, and we did have something called a rights offering, which was a way to allow all of the existing investors to participate and basically protect their investment in the new round of funding, but their prior investment was, going to be substantially diluted. So, and it's hard. And the thing was, even at the time, we had, I think, close to 45 investors in the company. So it was what, some people would say a fairly complex or messy cap table.
Yeah.
I was told that multiple times, and, it was. And, when you've got to get that many investors to basically agree to go along with something that's going to be hard, that's basically going to mean taking a loss on the money you've already invested, that's a very tough negotiation. Unfortunately, we were in a situation where there really wasn't an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
So because, it would have been nice to be able to find some investors who were going to invest, lead an up round, but it just wasn't feasible and there wasn't time. Right. So anyway, to make a long story short, Tell
us a little bit about kind of because I want the audience to understand, to go through a recapitalization like Chris is talking about with 45 different investors is really complicated, because you've got to get 45 different, and just to make clear, an investor is not necessarily just an individual. An investor can be a company, a venture capital firm, a private equity firm. I mean, there's any number. It can be a trust. It can be, there's all different types of investors. So when he says 45 investors, that doesn't mean 45 people. That means 45 individuals and probably hundreds of people that have to get involved in the different decision points. So tell me a little bit about kind of the profile of the 45 investors and how the motivations of kind of the different profiles came into play as you were thinking about how you were going to even approach the conversation of recapitalization.
Right. Well, you're right. The majority of them, and there might not have been 45 at the time. I think around the time that, we wound up selling the company just to preview this year, there were probably a little close to 50. So maybe it was more like 40, but there were a lot of investors. The majority of them were what I would, what are normally characterized as angels. So i.e. high net worth individuals. So I would say, I'm guessing off the top of my head, but 90% of them were, individual investors. And then, yes, there are a few venture capital firms or, what you might call entities as opposed to individuals involved. So, on the one hand, it really becomes a simple negotiation, right? Because the alternative is that the company has to close down and then everybody basically gets nothing. And it's just a matter of, it really became a negotiation around do you want the business to continue to kind of maintain your opportunity to get something out of this, or do you want it to close down where everybody gets nothing? And so, and that sounds like a very, I don't know what the right word is, a difficult position to take. And it is a difficult position to take in a negotiation, particularly when you're coming in new, although I think to some degree coming in new made it probably easier for me than it had been for the prior team because, I wasn't there when all of these prior monies had been invested. All I was dealing with was really the situation as it is today. And so I wasn't the person who necessarily had gone around to these prior investors and, made commitments and solicited their money. And I think it would have been very, very hard for, one of the founders to go do that. So it was a little bit easier for me as a pseudo outsider. But, we did think that we had enough opportunity in the nonprofit space to try to build something here, but it just wasn't possible to, maintain the existing capital structure and go on and go forward. So it kind of became a, A or B, And then, the rights offering, which, I won't take credit for that idea, but I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, was essentially to give all the investors, which we did. Mm-hmm. And it was exclusively available. By the way, there was, I believe it was 60 days. It might have been 90 days. Maybe it was 90 days that we gave the existing investors the exclusive right to, if they wanted to invest in the new round, to participate. And a number did. Quite a few didn't as well, but there were, a significant number. I would say maybe about 20-30% of them did participate, and the rest chose not to.
Right.
But again, it was a better alternative than the other option at the time. Then we managed to raise some money and managed to start to implement, some improvements in the business. And so we were doing pretty well in the second half of 2019 once we got this done. This all finished, it closed in June of 2019 was when the recapitalization happened. Then there was like another 90 days of raising money after that. And then so in the second half of 2019, we were like, okay, we came through that. All of the investors still had a piece of the business, not necessarily the size of the piece that they had before the recapitalization, but, at least, and the business was ongoing and we were starting to grow again. And, we put ourselves in a much better capital position. Mm-hmm. So we had kind of the right foundation in place to take the business forward. So
and then fast forward then, so you went through all this effort to do this recap in 2019, mid 2019.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then fast forward, then COVID happens, and it does what it does. And then and then you guys sold, right?
Yeah, well, it wasn't quite so quick, but COVID then happened. And, I remember very vividly, it was really around this time last year. The DipJar itself is a hardware product, and a lot of our components come from Asia. And the guy at the time who was running our production and supply chain came to me and he said, we really have to get our orders in, especially early this year, for inventory for the spring, because we serve nonprofits, we're usually busy 2 times a year, spring and fall. Right. And we had a good fall 2019. Mm-hmm. It's usually right around Thanksgiving that things start to maybe slow down a little bit as you go into the winter. We were just coming out of that. But he said, we have Chinese New Year, and so the factories typically shut down for a while for that reason, but they're also dealing with this virus that is starting to shut things down early, and all the suppliers are warning us we really need to get the orders in. And so we did. And so the thing was, we wound up, because when you're ordering from Asian suppliers, you're a small company, you don't have great terms, you have to lay out capital. So, we laid out a considerable amount of capital to put our orders in. We got our orders in. Our suppliers were getting nervous about this virus that was hitting Asia. But, as you may remember, obviously with hindsight, we would have made some very different decisions. Sure. But, even back, if you recall, it was obviously the origin of the pandemic in the U.S. has been talked about a lot. There's still some debate whether it was actually here in late 2019, but most people seem to accept that it didn't get here to early 2020. But so we had laid out a lot of cash. We had a lot of inventory, a lot of the cash we just raised. Yeah. And we got our orders in, and most of the materials started coming in. And then all of a sudden, things they happened really, really quickly. We had actually just moved to new offices. We just moved the team, which was actually good. It wasn't like we took on spectacular new offices. We actually kind of renegotiated on the real estate side and wound up getting ourselves a better deal. More importantly, got ourselves a more suitable office space than what we'd been in previously. But yeah, sales basically stopped dead on March 10th. I remember that was the day, or pretty close to the day. I remember Mark Cuban sitting at the Mavericks game, looking at his phone in the seats, and the game was canceled. And, the world just came to a slamming halt, and March Madness and everything else, as you know. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, it was like sales went from starting to go into our spring to just coming to a complete slamming halt. So all of a sudden we found ourselves in a position once again, and a heck of a lot sooner than we expected to, where we needed to go back or I need to go back and talk to the investors again. And we had already been talking about it. We were having, regular board meetings, not really so much about COVID until it really happened in March. But I remember we wound up pushing our normal Q1 board meeting had moved from January to February. We were already starting to say, what's this? Is this going to affect us? And boy, we have a lot of cash laid out. And so, yeah, we suddenly got to a place where, and a full team of people, a new space. Now what do we do, right? So because we thought we had sufficient capital to, grow through early 2020, we were planning to probably raise what I was calling kind of a real round of money in late 2020, like now, and go out and raise a bigger round. Because we'd raised, post the recapitalization, we'd raised a relatively modest amount of capital. We'd raised some capital, but it was relatively modest. We thought it was enough. It wasn't enough.
Right.
And it was pretty clear. And of course, the biggest thing at the time too, which was extremely hard, was our biggest expense by far was all of the people that we had. And so I guess two things before I talk about the sale. There was the very hard decision, right, of what do we do about the team? Now, of course, the other thing that was getting announced at the time was the various CARES programs. I sort of got a mini PhD in SBA loans programs, both the EIDL or EIDL loans, the Economic Industry Disaster loans, the PPP loans. We did eventually wind up securing a PPP loan. But, when we looked at it at the end of the day, and we didn't get it until a little later in the process because the banks we were using at the time weren't really PPP banks. So we wound up getting it through sort of a secondary source. By the time we got it, we didn't need it because we already had more than one party who was interested in buying the business. And so what ultimately happened was we did take in a PPP loan, but then we wound up paying it back because it also wasn't assignable. So once we had sort of found somebody who was interested in acquiring the business, we weren't able to carry it over. So we basically, by the time we got the money, it was sort of too late. So we had to do a big cutback. We kept the team on board for about a month, but when it became pretty apparent, which also influenced our thinking on things like PPP, because, PPP would have bought us 60 days, but it wasn't going to buy us, 6 months or 12 months, which is what this all turned out to be. So we had to do a big cutback just to be able to survive. And then, we must have had a dozen board meetings between, say, April 1st and Memorial Day, if not more. We were meeting regularly, talk about options. We definitely looked at, should we wind down the company? There was other strategies for maybe kind of keeping the company sort of going so we could kind of get through this on kind of a bare bones basis. But because we're providing a service in addition to hardware, we just didn't think that was practical. We didn't know how we were going to be able to continue serving our customers at all if we did that. And so we also said, well, let's talk to a few parties. I mean, there had been discussions with various parties throughout the time of, hey, maybe at some point we'd be interested in buying this business. So we ultimately decided to do a round of outreach to a few of those parties we had talked to. And there were a number of them. And explored a few conversations. And in a couple of cases, one in particular, realizing that everybody's business was being severely hurt, but also seeing the long-term potential, there was potentially interested in acquiring the business. And so that was the route we chose to go. As it turned out, the entity that we approached, at one point, there had been discussions about them buying us outright, but instead of doing that for their own reasons that I can't really get into here, they decided to put an investor group together. So what happened was we got acquired essentially by a new entity that was a group of investors from a number of companies that kind of, pooled their capital and put together a new group. So essentially the way it worked out was we were bought by a new investor group, but the business continued on an as-is basis. So we're not a subsidiary of another company or anything like that. We're still independent. We're actually, our legal name isn't DipJar anymore, but it continues to be the trade name we go by. Right. So, but yeah, that was an interesting process too.
I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me, Chris, is that, so one of the things that I talk a lot about, I actually have a webinar that I've done on renegotiation, and a recurring theme for you at DipJar is renegotiating. You come in, you have to renegotiate with the investors. Then things change as a result of COVID, and you got to renegotiate with them again, right? And you're also at the same time renegotiating with your employees and your suppliers. And so let's dive into that a little bit. And I always am, and it's always fascinating to me where kind of my conversations kind of take me when I'm doing these interviews. And but because this renegotiation theme is really significant, and one of the things that, so I live in Los Angeles. We're headquartered in Los Angeles, and I was recently at an event, and the head of the Port of Los Angeles was one of the speakers on a panel, and they were talking. She was talking about how imports are really affecting, and the tariffs are really affecting small business in particular, because product that sat in the harbor for weeks, came into the harbor. The Port of Los Angeles has had the busiest year on record, and generated their highest profit on record. Just to be clear, but what they've said, and this was reinforced by a guy who's the senior executive of a transportation company and some others that were on the panel, that small business is kind of getting left out in the cold when it comes to the distribution of goods as it's come into port, because it's being diverted to bigger companies. How did you have to renegotiate? So you had suppliers in China who were impacted, who had shut down before we did, right? And, as they came back online, kind of how did that renegotiation take place? What was some of the things that you had to do there?
Well, I didn't have to renegotiate much with our suppliers in Asia, although we're starting to do some of that now as we're looking to, because the business has recovered to some degree. I mean, we still have a ways to go, but that's starting now. But at the time, most of what I needed came in. To your point about tariffs, we absolutely did get hit with very large tariff bills, which was painful. And I know that there was a lot of, the political campaigns went in a different direction from tariffs, claiming that the other countries pay the tariffs. No, they don't. We paid the tariffs. So, unfortunately, costs that, we didn't directly pass them on to customers, but ultimately, they're costs that we need to recover somehow or another. So yeah, we paid a lot of tariff costs, but I didn't have to do a lot of renegotiation there, at least. But, we're in the process of doing some of that right now. Look, I do think that, almost all the people I deal with, I'll say almost, are reasonable people, and everybody understands the world has changed a lot these past few months. And so there's general openness to renegotiation in the most part. It's funny. We had our team call this morning, our typical Monday team call, and I was talking about one of our software vendors who I won't name, although they're a pretty well-known software company. And I was saying, when all of this happened, I did go around all our vendors and say, hey, can we work with you? And there was one in particular who's an important vendor and who's a company I have a lot of respect for too. But everybody said yes. They said no. And I almost threw them overboard because I got so enraged that they just basically said they wouldn't negotiate and, just pay your bill and, tough. And that was really, really frustrating to deal with. Although I was also saying this morning, I was gratified that I didn't throw them overboard, because we're actually renewing our agreement with them now, because they do play a very valuable role, and it would have been painful to replace them. But anyway, my point is, yeah, the renegotiation of trade terms hasn't been too tough, with some exceptions like I just named, but certainly something that's been necessary. And yeah, I'm sure it's gone on everywhere, but it's also had weird impacts. Like you said, it's made some businesses a lot stronger, but for the most part, many of us have been severely hurt by it. And so, when you go in with that understanding, most reasonable people are at least going to be willing to hear it, right, and consider it. But yeah, there's been a lot of little renegotiations and then a few big ones. So,
got it. Yeah, so we do. So we at Event Negotiation, we kind of created a quiz that people can go and they can take and learn their default negotiation style, because there's a style that's very, very much focused on winning at all costs. And in a renegotiation, that particular style, which we call a champion, is because they're a champion for him or herself, and that's about it. They are. If that's who you have to negotiate with to get a renegotiation, that's really difficult. They tend to dig their heels in. They see no value, no benefit in it. And they kind of just, expect people to just, they really fall into we have a contract, so you have to deal with it. Something as simple as like, we live in downtown Los Angeles. And so we lease our loft, and our landlord's like, because we've never missed a rent payment and we've always paid on time, but we have a bunch of people in our building who, just like a vendor is dealing with, they have customers who aren't paying their bills on time, right? And so we're like, well, we want a better rate because we're paying him. They're like, that's what we expect. We expect you to pay your bill on time. And I'm like, okay, that's not the way this works right now. So,
right.
But when you're in a David and Goliath negotiation, which I envision, I have a vision of which vendor you are referencing. And if it is the vendor that I am envisioning, I have negotiated with them. I've negotiated with most of the big tech guys, but
Yep.
but yeah,
they're mid-big, I would say. So anyway,
okay, got it.
Yeah.
So, but it is those David and Goliath negotiations are always really interesting. But let's go back to the investor kind of situation, and keep telling us a little bit more about how you went through all the recap, you hit that point, and kind of now where are you at with your investor base, and what are some what are some examples of things that you did because I often talk about how you can be somebody who's negotiating one thing. From your position, it's one thing, but you're negotiating with 10 different entities or 10 different people.
Right.
And it's really 10 separate negotiations because your counterparts, even if your objective is one thing, your counterpart always sees it differently. So you end up kind of having 10 very different types of negotiation. What are some things that you saw as you were going through this process on the recap and then the sale with the investor base? And what are some tips that you can share with our listeners on things that you did to move those discussions forward with different individuals?
Well, first of all, I would say that investor groups, my experience both here and elsewhere is that usually they kind of move. It's not real, like if you have 10 or 45, it's not really 10 or 45. There's usually a couple of leads. Typically any investment round, there's one lead, but there typically might be multiple investors who kind of share at least some percent of the lead. So, in my case, there was probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 of the 45 that, were significantly involved in, and the rest for the most part will follow along because they tend to be smaller investors. And,
that's important.
So they're kind of participating in a syndicate to some degree. Right. Yep. So, or they might have in the past. And so they've become part of a new one now. So there's that. But I think the most important thing is to be, at least for me, and it's the way I tend to be, is just matter of fact. Here are the alternatives. Really try to remove emotion from it. Again, that's something I do think was easier for me because I wasn't the person, or I wasn't part of the team that originally had to go convince the investor and make promises on, how great it was going to be down the road, and just kind of present like, here it is. And, look, I'm coming into this new too, right? And this is not fun for any of us, but just be very matter of fact about it and really take emotion out of it as much as you can. Now that's easy to say when it's not your money. Right. So, but also for the most part, most professional investors, and I would include angels and certainly, certainly like venture firms and the like, they're pretty unemotional about it too. They get it. They understand it. So might not be their favorite conversation to have all day. They've been through it. Right. Exactly. So I think it's just a matter of keeping things professional, keeping things unemotional. And it was a little easier for me, I guess, to be detached since I came into the situation new. So that was thing number one. I
just want to add. I want to before you continue. I want to add on that. So there are a number of books. So Jed Blount's book, Inked, is one that comes to mind. Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference, which we end up talking about a lot on the show. Both of those books talk about emotion, and Jed's book, which Inked is his latest book, he has a ton of them, and he specializes in sales, which, as many of our listeners know, sales is, for me, is a part of negotiation, but it's not all of the negotiation. But one of the things that he talks about is the person who can't check his or her emotion. The person who gets emotional is going to lose in the negotiation. You will give up more if you are emotionally invested, if you overreact from an emotional perspective. And Chris Voss talks about tactical empathy. And one of the things I love about his book is that he's one of the first ones who really kind of made a big deal out of the fact that whether we like it or not, negotiation is absolutely an emotional activity. Because as soon as you want something from somebody else, you have an emotional investment in that outcome. But letting your emotions get control of you, and when you're in a startup, and if you are the founder of the organization, I see this all the time working with founders. They get emotionally attached to their idea, and then it becomes very difficult for them to separate that emotion from the conversation. And that's why for you coming in, Chris, when you did, and certainly for me, when I come in to support my clients, it allows for kind of a separation. That emotional impact is different. And as a result for you coming in when you did, and me when I work with my clients, we can do things, we can ask things, we can be really straightforward and really direct and lay it on the line without having that emotional baggage that comes into play. So,
well, it's interesting because if you noticed before, I'm sure you did, I digressed a little bit to talking about employees. And I have found that, first of all, as we were just talking about, for the most part, my investors are all professional investors, or the company's investors, probably a better way to say it. And, in some cases, there was a little emotion here and there, but for the most part, that wasn't a big factor. With employees, totally different story. Past, present, future, it's the team. I think in a lot of ways, the negotiation with the team has been the hardest thing of all. In a lot of ways, it's been harder to negotiate with the people in the company who used to work for the company, old employees, new employees, people who came through, which was only a small number of us. Those were the harder negotiations because they got very emotional. And of course, I'm an employee as well, right? So, and it's hard to kind of put your own self-interest aside and kind of step back and see things unemotionally too. But yeah, I would say for the most part, as I mentioned, one of our advisors, and he's actually CEO I'd worked with a number of times. He was really the guy who pulled me in, and part of the reason he pulled me in because he also knew the investors well as well. We had all worked together. And one of the things he said to me, and this was during the recap, I think last year, that's always stuck with me. He said, I was going in to negotiate with who eventually was our lead. And he just said, just remember, he does this for a living. Like he does this every day. This is sort of our lead investor. And it's true, and he was great, super supportive investor, really smart, knowledgeable about the business, absolutely could put it aside. But, and so, professional investors, that's what they're really, really good at the separation, I guess.
Right.
And I witnessed that, and I appreciated that too. So, but yeah, it was a lot harder to do with some of the employment negotiations that have sort of both gone or even going. Yep.
And I think that's one of the things though, that as you're talking, that is kind of really sticks out for me as I'm listening to you describe the situation, is that some of the things you're good at are really kind of understanding the diversity of your constituent base, right? So understanding what's driving the individual investors, but also what's driving the employees, and figuring out that it's the same negotiation, but two completely different perspectives. And sometimes small businesses, they'll get stuck into this is the perspective, and I'm going to negotiate this perspective, but it fails. That approach fails to take into account the counterpart's perspectives, and that those perspectives are different depending on the counterpart. And so that, I think, goes to kind of your skill as a negotiator and what it is you do. So that was kind of one of the things you said you learned, and then I interrupted you to interject that before you got to number two. So.
Yeah, well, and I'm trying to remember what number two was, but I'm trying to think back, because I remember it's one of the Chris Voss points, because I do think Never Split the Difference, definitely one of the best. And it's not even really a business book per se. It's just a book, right? It's more a book about hostage negotiating, but how you can apply some ideas behind hostage negotiation. But I think the power of no, which I don't know if that's exactly the way they say it. That's also one of the most important things to understand. And, it's a little bit different than most people think. You've obviously read the book. It's not just about, being willing and able to say no, which I've learned how to do a lot, particularly these last couple of years, but it's also about giving somebody else in a negotiation the option to say no is actually very empowering for them. And I think that's a really important point. And I mentioned before the rights offering that we kind of did. And again, it was actually our attorney's idea. I don't know if it was even an idea or just something they said, look, if we're going to go down this path, this is something you have to do. You have to offer all of the investors the option to participate exclusively before you bring in any new investors and so on and so forth. And we did. And, the fact that we did, the majority of them said no, but at least they had the option to do that. But, I don't know, maybe that's a bad example because that's more of a legal example. But I think just really in any negotiation, right? A lot of times people feel railroaded or feel pushed, or they feel like that things are going in an uncomfortable direction in negotiation. If you have the right to say no, say stop, to say I'm out, then okay, I feel at least I've got more control. And paradoxically, that leads to them feeling more like, oh, okay, wow, I have some control. So maybe I'm more willing to participate and hear what they say next if they just gave me the opportunity to say no. So the giving the opportunity to say no, I think, is really powerful. There is one of the investors, and again, I can't name names in particular, who, but it was somebody who had been a very early investor in the company, who I knew, by the way, outside. And so I had actually known them before I took the role on. It wasn't one of the investors who necessarily participated in recruiting me, but it turned out it was one of the early investors of somebody I'd known. And they were very frustrated by certain things, probably that had predated me. And they knew it had little to nothing to do with me because I hadn't been here at the time. Sure. But they kind of just chose to disengage from the process. But they also didn't stand in the way of anything. They're professional investors. They just, I think, felt, okay, it was just kind of their way of saying no, but recognizing that, there were only two possible paths. So the company had to go down one path or the other. But instead of participating or endorsing, they were just going to choose to sort of exercise the right to step aside, so to speak. Yeah. And they did. And so on the one hand, they didn't really participate, but on the other hand, they certainly didn't block anything that needed to happen either. And, giving them the opportunity to do that probably helped move things along. So, you hit on a few things. Anyway,
you hit on a few things in there. One, I think that, we talk a lot about how power is something that we actually choose to acquiesce. So I always have a thing when people who talk about negotiations talk about who's in position of power, because I believe that power is something that you voluntarily acquiesce and give to somebody. So I have to give somebody my power in order for me not to have it, because the ultimate leverage, the ultimate power is the ability to say no. That is the ultimate leverage. And the fact that you're sitting having a negotiation or a renegotiation, the fact that that dialogue is open means that there's some rationale for both of you to be sitting there and having that conversation in the first place. So no is the ultimate exercise of leverage in my view. And I think that it's something that people, a lot of negotiation, people with different negotiation styles, there's certain negotiation styles that are very uncomfortable saying no, because they think that it's going to damage the relationship over time. And what you're describing with this one investor is kind of a way of I've negotiated deals where I've literally negotiated to get the other side to say no, because no was in my best interest or my client's best interest, but my client was not the one who wanted to say no. So we created an environment where it was not a likely good deal and that the counterpart decided to exit, which was just fine by us, right? So you never know what the motive is of somebody, but and trying to guess the motive versus trying to discover the motive. Never try to guess the motive, try to discover the motive, and then speak to that. But I think that what you're talking about is really important, that you have that kind of dialogue and you give people the opportunity to bow out, to say, no, this isn't going to work for me. Because negotiation, as I say all the time, is nothing more than a conversation about a relationship. It's all a negotiation is. There's nothing more to it than that. And if the relationship isn't working for me, then guess what? It's not working for you too. You just don't know it yet, right? And it's like, so if we're going to make it work, then we've got to be able to have those conversations and create that opportunity for people to be open and transparent about what's working and what's not working in the relationship.
Right. Well, and again, professional investors, they say no all the time. If anything, getting a no from an investor is a good thing, because typically they're not going to directly say no. They're going to be very indirect about it, because they want to maintain their optionality, because, hey, I don't want to invest right now. And there could be a whole lot of reasons an investor doesn't want. It could be timing related. It could be competitor related. It could be a lot of reasons they don't want to invest right now when you're trying to raise money, but they want to preserve their optionality. So even getting them to say no, that can be a bigger win, because a lot of them just kind of, you don't really know where you stand all the time. Again, another topic that I think is much harder in employment negotiations. I will say another thing too. Like we were based out of an incubator for a while, and I've worked in a number of like startup centers where you're around, and it was funny because you often hear founders, and I have been a founder as well. But it goes back a few years. But founders get very upset at investors because they get very emotional about what they founded and what they started, and emotion creeps into it, and it's just interesting to see. And there hasn't been, obviously, this has been kind of a weird year, so you don't hear as much about it now. But all of this friction between founders and investors, it's all about emotion. So, and founders, it takes a lot of passion to be a founder. So, and it is a lot easier, like, me in some respects, to come in later and not really have the emotional attachment to the founding of the business, and remember when the incorporation was signed, and the original team, and we were working out of the garage and all of that. You can just kind of walk in and say, okay, what do we have to do? Right. So, but founders tend to get so attached. And as I've said probably 8 times now, investors, most of the ones I've dealt with, the pros, they stay very detached. And I think that sort of, that mismatch is what causes probably a lot of the friction and hard feeling that doesn't need to be. So, but in any case, that's a whole nother topic.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
No, but I do think that's an interesting topic, and maybe we'll, on a future episode, we'll have to explore that some, because I mean, people who start businesses, especially in the tech industry, are rarely the people who run them. Right? They usually exit, and there's a reason for that. Because a lot of times that objectivity that's required to make some very hard decisions becomes so emotional that it becomes very difficult for a founder to do that. They want to run it day to day. But yeah, that's
and it's just different skill sets and many other reasons, right? And it does happen on occasion. So the Mark Zuckerbergs and Jeff Bezoses of the world, Bill
Gates and right?
Yep. Those people exist, but nonetheless, the majority of the time, it's like you said.
Exactly.
So, yep.
So Chris, let me ask you. So we're about out of time, but this has been fantastic, and the amount of information that you've shared has just been phenomenal. And you're kind of my first conversation talking about the investor side of things and working with the investors as a small business. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me and to be here with the audience. How can people find you? How can they find DipJar?
Well, I would say, me personally, LinkedIn is a good place to poke around. I tend to be, it's funny because it goes back to when you and I were first networking, and LinkedIn was kind of a new thing back then. I met the founding team, including Reed, at LinkedIn very, very early. So I got on LinkedIn early. I've been a big LinkedIn user, but for the same reason, I don't just take like unsolicited, but I would say drop me a note on LinkedIn, and you can find me there. Or you can go to dipjar.com. I think my email's up there somewhere. But yeah, I'm pretty responsive on LinkedIn. And of course, the company is at dipjar.com. So
perfect.
So that's probably the 2 best places to go, rather than giving out my email or phone number. But yeah,
yes,
I'm pretty responsive on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. You have been an amazing guest. I hope this has been a great experience for you. And we will put Chris's LinkedIn profile into the show notes.
Make it even easier.
And make it DipJar's email or website in the show notes as well. So thank you very much. I look forward to having you guys all stay tuned and come back and listen to our next episode of In the Venn Zone. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great day. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Venn Zone with Christine McKay. We invite you to visit our website at www.venn.zone to access the show notes and other helpful resources. Empower the negotiator in you and successfully level the playing field. Join us again next time here on In the Venn Zone.